Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Fabian Health Policy Group and Young Fabian Health Network joint launch of the Fabian Perspectives of Mental Health and discussion on mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Martin Edward. I'm the Vice Chair of the Fabian Society. I'm also a NHS GP working in East London, and I will be chairing the event for you today. So first of all, it's a really important moment for all of us as the country is still getting to grips with the coronavirus pandemic. And one issue that is still needing to be tackled is the mental health crisis that we are seeing in the UK. The Fabian Health Policy Group, working together with the Young Fabian Health Network, has put together a collection of essays from leading activists and thinkers, including Mayor Andy Burnham, Dr. Gemma Ashwell, the president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, Professor Wendy Byrne. And today we have one panelist who contributed to the policy document, as well as other expert speakers. The publication can be downloaded in the link being posted, where you can read the different essays and contributions. Today, we'll be focusing on the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on mental health. And today we've got three amazing speakers. First of all, we have Emma Stevenson, who is the Parliamentary Liaison Officer for the Young Fabian Health Policy Group. She was an essay contributor to the policy pamphlet on mental health that's being presented today. And also she works for Macmillan. And it's so great to have her here today. Additionally, we have another amazing speaker, Milo Barnett, who is the chair of the Young Fabian Health Network and has been working with the Young Fabians to deliver pioneering work looking at structural health inequality. And it'll be great to hear his thoughts today. Additionally, we're going to also be joined by Dr. Rosanna Allen Khan, MP, Shadow Minister for Mental Health. She's just slightly delayed. She'll be with us in the next 5 minutes or so. Just to outline the structure of the event, initially we'll hear opening remarks from our speakers, and then we'll go into a question and answer town hall session. You can submit your questions in the Q&A box. I will be, potentially asking members of and attendees to actually speak and deliver the questions orally by the microphone function that we have here. So I'll just mention your name if I want you to ask the question verbally. So first of all, without any delay, I'm going to turn to Emma Stevenson to set the scene and talk to us about the way in which mental health has been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and also to reflect on her piece in the publication which focused on this issue. Emma.
Thank you, Martin, and thanks again to the Fabian Health and Care Policy Group for asking me to contribute to the pamphlet and to join them today for this great event. I'm going to try and summarise the crux of my contribution, as well as to highlight why I think it's so vital that we continue to have conversations about mental health during and beyond the pandemic. I haven't been living in lockdown, I've been surviving it. This is what a lady with secondary cancer told me a few weeks ago. She's categorised as clinically extremely vulnerable and has been shielding since lockdown began. She has been on antidepressants since she found out that her cancer had returned in December, and due to workforce pressures within her hospital, she was not assigned a secondary cancer nurse specialist until months into her treatment. And due to a lack of provision of personalised and integrated mental health support within her cancer pathway, she had to seek this out for herself. This was cancelled when lockdown was announced and no remote offer was made available. She's been having life-saving chemotherapy and immunotherapy during the pandemic. She's isolated from her family, has struggled accessing food and medicines, and is uncertain and fearful about what the future holds as the shielding scheme ends at the end of this month. COVID has affected all of us, and most people's mental health has suffered to some extent. Whilst we have all experienced the weight of necessary social distancing measures on our well-being and that of our colleagues, neighbours, friends and family, the psychological toll has been borne unequally. The repercussions are being termed as a social recession, a term which received significant usage following the financial crisis in 2008 and resultant economic recession and years of austerity. Social recession is defined as the sustained decline in the quality and stability of couple, family, and social relationships. Good quality relationships are important for public health and well-being, while relationship breakdown has been shown to cause ill health in adults and children. Addressing increased social isolation and reduced sustained feelings of loneliness are important early priorities for all of us. Although social media and digital communication present possibilities for promoting belongingness and maintaining social ties, unequal access to technology and levels of technological literacy often prevent the most vulnerable from engaging in these digital interventions in the first place. Experiences of social loss and psychological burden during the pandemic have been heavier and more acute for people in society who are most vulnerable to loneliness and isolation, marginalisation and deprivation, and often the people who are most vulnerable to the virus itself. The easing of lockdown restrictions has only intensified the unequal physical, mental, and human cost of the social recession left in the wake of COVID-19. Before the outbreak of the virus, it had become a commonplace to see news of the UK in the grip of a mental health crisis and the hidden loneliness epidemic. This was all occurring against a backdrop of chronic underfunding of health and social care and devastating workforce shortages. COVID-19 has more deeply exposed and intensified these crises. The mental health charity Mind have reported a sharp rise in demand for their services, and in a recent survey found that nearly a quarter of people who had tried to access help to deal with mental health issues during the early stages of lockdown had been unable to do so. When people did not seek help, 41% said this was because they didn't think that their issues were important enough. These worrying figures come at a time when social distancing and isolation from loved ones, the practical implications of the pandemic, and increasing unemployment and financial insecurity have led to a sharp rise in anxiety, stress, depression, and self-harm, particularly among those with underlying physical and mental health conditions or disabilities, people from BAME and LGBT+ backgrounds, people from socioeconomically deprived backgrounds or insecure work, victims and witnesses of domestic abuse, and those on the front line of the national response to the virus. Recent YouGov polling commissioned by Macmillan Cancer Support found that 22% of people with cancer have diagnosed depression and anxiety, and 41% said their well-being has been affected during COVID. Of those, 68% felt anxious or depressed, and 21% have had suicidal thoughts or panic attacks. Just 2% have accessed support from psychological specialists. We cannot afford to underestimate the long-term implications of the virus on mental health. For those of us who are able to do so, I suggest that we sign up to a social contract to ensure those who are most vulnerable to the physical, emotional, and psychological dangers of the virus feel truly part of the fabric of society and do not fall through the cracks. This includes taking ownership of our own well-being. Neuroscience has shown that social and physical pain are more similar than we imagine. We don't expect someone with a broken leg to just get over it. Yet when it comes to the pain of social loss, this is a common and mistaken response. Today's economic statement from Rishi Sunak is a sticking plaster. But as we learned from the last recession, the catastrophic job losses and financial hardship took some time to materialise and continue to have catastrophic consequences to this day. Within the charity sector, we feel as if we are currently fighting to maintain a status quo that is not good enough. However, we're waiting to see what the settlement for the NHS will look like. We await the workforce strategy via the NHS People Plan, and indeed NHS and social care reform, as well as the urgent need to bring the Mental Health Act into the 21st century. We await the worst economic downturn since records began, which will no doubt bear witness to rationing of NHS resources and increased pressures on already stretched mental health services at a time when diminished charity sector will be unable to plug the gap. The social recession brought on by the coronavirus, the mental and physical burden of measures to contain it, and the repercussions of necessary economic interventions will spell a difficult future ahead. Policies need to invest in relationships and communities and positively utilise their value. Parity of esteem requires a mental health in all policies approach going forward. Undoubtedly, for most of us, our mental health has suffered during the pandemic. But if we fail to acknowledge the unequal weight of the psychological toll across society, the mental health crisis exacerbated by the outbreak will have graver consequences still. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, for so eloquently putting in stark terms the impact that COVID-19 has had on the mental health of our nation. Just to add on to that, according to the Office of National Statistics, 20% of people have reported feeling a level of anxiety or depression during the pandemic. And it has had such a terrifying impact on our nation's health. I just want to turn now to Milo Barnett to add some further comments on the issue. Milo.
Thank you, Martin, and that was excellent, Emma. I think in terms of what we're facing the greatest crisis we have known since the war. And that's not just in terms of economic, but that is mental health, because they are intangibly linked. It's reported by the Centre of Mental Health that up to 500,000 people will be experiencing mental health issues. And these are people who have had, coming from all walks of life, all parts of the UK, but they're experiencing this emotional journey as part of COVID, because simply we're going into the unknown. We don't know how long this is going to be like, how we're going to react to a second wave, job losses, what have you. This is something which we cannot compare to, but that means that we have to take radical action and make sure we are willing to take the necessary steps of investing in our mental health services, making sure there's a clear communications among all participants and services, that they understand that there's going to be mental health issues across the board, and that people know where they can turn to. You know, we're living in an age where people are going up and down the country because their tendencies are changing. They're not working, so they're having to move in with their parents. That means changing their NHS, local GP. We need to make sure the system is as friendly and as flexible as possible. You know, we have a system where you can register in 2 different properties to vote, but you can't register in 2 different GPs. So we need to make sure the system, it has these artificial barriers that need to be ready for the 21st century. And hopefully COVID, where you look at silver linings, can be a catalyst. So we look at how working from home has delivered some positives to a lot of people who prefer that method and wanting to stay, even if some people are missing the office environment. But that can foster loneliness and other issues. So we have to make sure that what progress we are making in making sure people's lives as comfortable as possible are taken into consideration, and make sure that what edges there are sanded down to make sure it's as comfortable as possible. And I think we also have to deal with trauma in terms of, I talk about, you know, we might not think we are experiencing trauma if you don't know anybody's lost somebody, but in times of pandemic, trauma does happen. There's often thought that the Spanish flu killed millions of people around the world and left a sort of psychological legacy, but that was mostly muffled by the First World War. We need to make sure that we're able to adapt to circumstances, and we can't just let things go by. We have people where care homes have lost nearly 40% of renters in some cases, and on average 20%. You have to think of how that's a generation that's just gone. You know, admittedly that's an older generation, but still that's going to affect their friends, their family, also the people that are caring for them. The emotional strain on our healthcare workers, whether they're the front line or behind services, it's staggering. We have to think about that and how we're thinking about not just next month or 6 months down the line, but years down the line, because mental health isn't a short-term fix. We don't need a sticking plaster. We need good, solid care, and that takes money, that takes resources, that takes training, time, and effort. And we can only do that if we come together and make sure that mental health is at the forefront of a complete dialogue in terms of making sure when you think of NHS, you think of mental health services.
Thank you, Milo, for those comments and some really important words to reflect on. I can see Dr. Rosanna Allen Khan has joined us. Hello, Rosanna. As I mentioned earlier, Rosanna is going to be joining us to give us her remarks on mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic. Rosanna is the Shadow Minister for Mental Health, and I'm going to turn to Rosanna now. After Rosanna's remarks, we'll open it up to the Q&A, as I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to turn to Rosanna. Hello, Rosanna.
Lovely. Hello. Can you guys hear me okay? Just wanted to check you can.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, it's amazing to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everyone for their contributions to the pamphlet. I think it really shows what we can do when we come together and prove how importantly we take issues like mental health and how seriously we see this as an issue that needs addressing. And this collection of essays contributes massively to the discourse around mental health. And together, it sets out a progressive vision for the future of mental health, recognising the social and economic benefits of investing in wellbeing and tackling the social drivers of mental health inequality. And I think what is so great about the pamphlet is that it reinforces the notion that mental health policy can't be determined in a silo. The interaction between socioeconomic factors and physical health outcomes are well documented, and understanding that these factors interact the same way with mental health will be vital when we develop policy going forward. And I think when we look at things like how adverse childhood experiences dictates the likelihood of developing mental ill health later on in life, it's very clear that without looking at the real drivers of inequality from the start of someone's life, unless we do this, we're never really going to get on top of tackling our mental health crisis. And when you think that so many young Black men, for example, it is only discovered that they are suffering with mental ill health when they're already in the criminal justice system, that in itself is a crime. If as a society, we have failed to address, tackle and identify these issues before somebody has been incarcerated, we are letting down an entire generation of young people. And to achieve true parity of esteem, we have to ensure that our actions match our rhetoric. It's not simply good enough to stand there with warm words and say, look, we want a parity of esteem between mental health and physical health. Everybody says that. That's a real buzz phrase. What do we do as politicians? What do we do as community leaders? What do we do as a society to show how much we truly value that? And we have to truly invest in mental health services the same way as we do physical services. We need to ensure that services are culturally sensitive and accessible to our BAME communities, and we need to take quick, decisive action to tackle the mental health workforce crisis. That I live in a world where my utopia would look like somebody being able to phone up their workplace and say, I don't feel as though I can come into work today because I am feeling really down. I'd love someone to be able to phone up and not worry that they were going to lose their job as a result of this, or worry that this was going to follow them all through their working life. I would love for people to be able to do that rather than phone up and think, gosh, I may as well just say I've got a bad tummy or a migraine because it's just not worth it. I would love it for people from certain communities to be able to go home and say to their families, Mum, Dad, I don't feel well. I don't feel like getting out of bed in the mornings. I get no joy out of anything in life, and not to be labelled a failure. I would like for there to be words in languages that exist for things like depression and anxiety. There are some languages in some communities where those words don't exist, because it's almost as though to express that you are suffering with mental ill health is some sort of failure. And this is a responsibility for us all to tackle, and it's one that we need to tackle within our community groups as well. And I think there's a real space for you know, for all sorts of like religious and community leaders to really lead on this. And investing in our services though simply isn't enough alone. We need a long-term strategy that recognises the unequal mental health burden faced by the most disadvantaged in our communities. A preventative strategy which focuses on improving well-being by addressing some of the great inequalities in society like poverty, discrimination and employment insecurity. Only then we will be able to see real parity of esteem. And for me, in my role, that has involved me working with our education members, our team in housing, because if you don't get these right, if we don't get these right as a society, we're never going to really get on top of tackling mental ill health. And we also have to look at some of the other drivers. Why is it, for example, that mental ill health proportionately actually, well, you know, disproportionately affects people from our LGBTQ plus communities? What is it about that? What can we do to be addressing that in schools? What can we do to be, you know, like changing our education system in school to talk about Black history, for example, in a more positive light rather than othering? What can we do to make people feel as though they are welcome, so they don't feel isolated? And what can we do to make it normal to talk about mental health? And look, when we look at the COVID pandemic, it's been really interesting for me, because in this role, I mean, I really wanted this role, and I'm really, really grateful to have it, because I have personal experience with very, very close friends who have suffered immeasurably with terrible mental health issues, some even trying to take their own lives. I've seen how, well, I've seen the differences working in A&E. I've seen what it's like to work under a Labour government and under a Tory government. And I've got to be honest, working under the government that we've had for the last 10 years, I'm seeing mental health services stripped from the inside out, a real lack of resources. I'm seeing children coming in self-harming. I used to see them coming in at 14, 15, now they're coming in as young as 11 or 12, because we have a society that tells them you're only a success, you're only something in your life if you have, you know, done well in your SATs at age 7 and in your SATs age 10, and you are defined by how good you are in English or maths, not by if you are creative, if you are happy. All of these things put an immense amount of pressure on young people. And we know that the ONS has revealed that 1 in 4 people feel more anxious than usual during this, you know, COVID pandemic. And the real impact of what the COVID pandemic has been on mental health, well, it's exacerbated pre-existing mental health issues. You know, public health fears, economic insecurity, social isolation, they're all the perfect storm for mental ill health. Now, there's some people who have said that they have suffered so much because peer support that they hugely relied on, such as things like Alcoholics Anonymous or eating disorder circles, have suddenly stopped. And with no plan for when these things can be restarted, people have just felt really lost and left out in the dark. People have an understanding of what's happening for businesses, sure, but what is happening for people who are vulnerable, who are really suffering with their mental health? So we're seeing people, we've got all the stats. I don't like to generally bore people with stats, but we have seen stats that show so many parents saying that their children were so heavily reliant on mental health support before the crisis, still needed ongoing help, and the help hasn't been forthcoming. People need answers. Some people have felt incredibly, incredibly isolated. So it has further exacerbated pre-existing issues. It has created new ones on a background of, you know, job insecurity and all the things I mentioned before. But it's also created a perfect storm within our NHS and care sector. We have people who have had to do unenviable things. I worked a fraction of what some of my colleagues did. I mean, I went and worked on our front line and saw awful death and suffered with my own mental health a little bit, you know, over this, but that doesn't compare to my colleagues who every day, day in, day out, they were watching people die, including their colleagues. They were breaking people's hearts, you know, with full PPE. We were tearing people's lives apart by telling them the person they love the most in the whole world has died, while not being able to hug them, and having masks and gowns and gloves. And this virus stripped the humanity out of grieving, and we have people who are so suffering with their mental health as a result, not to mention our BAME communities. I mean, what's happened to them is quite frankly a crime. Well, I say us because I'm also within our BAME community, and just knowing that there was staff on the front line who were sent in without PPE, they were not prioritized. So many BAME staff were not prioritized for the PPE that was available, because obviously there was a shortage. Many were sent in without PPE to clean the rooms of people who had died of COVID-19. We know that some of our Black and Asian cleaners in hospitals, for example, were not given scrubs when other members were, and were told to go home and take their uniform home with them, risking taking the virus home to their families. Look, I'm so disappointed with the way that the UK government has responded to the crisis. The fact that the government sat on evidence from Public Health England that showed that our BAME communities were adversely affected, and then try to palm it off on physiology, saying that, well, you know, Black and Asian people, they don't eat as healthily, they're more likely to have high blood pressure and hypertension. Yes, but our Caucasian community members are more likely to have cancer, another vulnerable group. I'm sorry, but when you look at who was driving our buses, when you look at who was serving at our checkouts, when you look at who was forced to go into rooms without PPE, who are we talking about here? You know, people from our BAME community are not one homogenous group of people who all share the same genetics. If you are Chinese, you have a very different genetic makeup and a very different set of risk factors to if you are, you know, Black Caribbean, to if you are South Asian. And the impact on the mental health and well-being of our society has been profound, and it may take many months and even years until the true reality of the impact is known. And alleviating this impact immediately and in the long term would form a key component of Labour's COVID-19 response. And I don't want to take up too much more time talking. I know there's going to be some Q&A, but just to say that when we come out of this crisis, and once I've done everything I can in this role to support people through this crisis, some of the other priorities that I have are investment in CAMS, child and adolescent mental health services, because I think if we do not get it right from the outset, we will never, ever get it right for our young people. Also, when you look at the fact that at 18, all of a sudden you have your 18th birthday and you just drop off of services, even if you're in the middle of having treatment or therapy, it is disgusting. If you look at the checklist of what people have to go through, even to get a CAMS referral in the first place, they can then wait a year or more. They then can be halfway through treatment or therapy, they hit 18, that's it for them. There's this huge, huge gap. And that leads me on to the next point, which is suicide prevention. The suicide rates in young people is escalating, particularly in young men. And I believe that that's got so much to do with the inequality that we spoke about earlier, with not investing in CAMS, with that drop-off point at 18. And the final thing is stigma, the stigma surrounding having mental ill health. So there is so much to really prioritize when it comes to the mental health brief, but post-COVID, and also what I think about and I'm very aware of within this crisis are CAMS investments, stigma, and suicide prevention. Hope that gives you some idea of what my focus is. And of course, I'm delighted to answer any questions, but I want anybody watching this to know today that it is okay not to feel okay. It is okay to have down days. It's okay to be vulnerable. It is normal. I can share that there have been days when I've come home from work crying, and I've found it really difficult to get out of bed in the morning because I don't know how to manage my emotions, and I've had to say to my family and friends, I'm struggling today. It is normal. You are not alone. There are people out there who can help you. My door is always open, and it is incredible that you guys, the young Fabians and the Fabians have taken it so seriously and put this pamphlet together. So thank you for all that you're doing to improve our community's mental health, because we only make it better by working together.
Thank you, Rosina, for those words. You know, you put everything into very sobering. You paint a very sobering picture, but also you put forward that 3-point plan. And I'm so glad to see you in the role as Shadow Mental Health Minister, because you're also a practicing doctor. You've been working on the front line. And as a GP myself, I know the huge amount of effort that you go to make sure you're embedded in the front line, that you know what's happening on the ground. So I'm so happy to see you there on the front bench. So now we're going to go to the Q&A section. Lots of questions flooding in. So I'll just quickly summarize again the way I'm going to run this. I'm going to clump some questions together, and I'm also going to point some people out to say their questions into the microphone, okay? We've got a very good question from Anne Daly, who I'm going to ask if she could answer, pose the question by speaking to the microphone. We're going to be turning your audio on. You have a very good question on debt, and it's linked to mental health. Anne, could you pose your question to the panelists? You're on mute. So if you unmute yourself, Anne.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Extremely pleased to hear that you are addressing this. So there's robust evidence that being in debt is linked to developing or accelerating poor mental health. And by being aware of this link when designing council tax arrears, the particularly collection process, including bailiffs, local authorities can reduce this risk. And I'm very pleased to hear that the risk of suicide has been mentioned. And this supports local people. So local campaigning can be really effective to get councils to adopt something called the Council Tax Protocol, or even better, the Prevention Concordat for better mental health. And there's a link there. So thank you very much for allowing my question.
Thank you. So in terms of, I just want to also add on to that, in terms of mental health, often there are so many contributing factors from socioeconomic. For example, if someone has a huge amount of debt, they lose their job because of COVID, that can also have an impact. So I want to, first of all, turn to you, Rosanna, to just provide some comments on what was said just then by Anne.
Well, I'm really glad you raised that. And I'm going to share something very personal, actually, which highlights your point entirely. So my dad has dementia. I've been very sort of outspoken about that in the past. And while he was still living in his property, he wasn't able to manage paying his council tax. We had phoned the council and explained that he doesn't quite understand how it's all happening. And we had made an agreement that we would pay that, but they didn't register that properly. And they kept on sending bailiffs round to his house. And he used to phone us completely distressed because there were people banging down his door trying to take things out of his house. So I know that whereas we may not necessarily be focusing on older people's mental health, just anybody who is suffering mental ill health, whether it be dementia, whether it be anxiety, whether it be depression, it is imperative that when it comes to things like being in debt, being in arrears, that we take a community-wide approach. And this, to me, highlights the issue of stigmatization. It should be very straightforward to be able to have a family member or yourself pick up the phone, call the council, explain that there is difficulty, and come up with another solution. Because you're absolutely right, this only exacerbates the problem. And often some people as well who are relying on medication to balance their mood, to stabilize their mood, having the bailiff showing up at their door, I'm sure Martin will know this from seeing people in his practice, it can push you over the edge, completely destabilize you. So I think there has to be greater understanding when it comes to people in debt and in arrears, and people should be sympathetic. And I think we should campaign for there to be more understanding within this field.
And I just want to bring in Emma, who also works for Macmillan, and in terms of talking about the other effects and contributing factors, patients who also have other comorbidities and medical conditions such as cancer can have a huge impact on people's mental health, especially going through COVID. So I wanted to get your thoughts, Emma.
Yeah, no, thank you, Martin, and thank you, Rosanna. Yeah, this is a really big issue. We know that people in significant debt are more likely to have mental health conditions, but also people with mental health conditions are more likely to suffer financial insecurity and inequality. With cancer, the cost of cancer pre-COVID, we estimated that it was £570 a month, which takes into account additional travel costs, heating bills, having to buy new clothing, travel insurance, potentially having to take out loans, cost of treatment. So that was pre-COVID. And there are lots of additional costs that come with COVID as well. And we know especially that people from BAME backgrounds and socioeconomically deprived backgrounds are hit even harder financially, and don't necessarily always have the sort of support network to call on to maybe plug the gaps. So, to take time out of work to cover their transport costs. It's really significant, and cancer, mental health, for their financial situation is so inextricably linked, and something we're really incredibly concerned about going forward, especially 250,000 people with cancer are currently shielding. We know that 570,000 people with cancer are shielding of their own accord, and up to 800,000 people have only left for medical appointments, which means that 3 times the amount of people with cancer who have been given their shielded letter are, are isolating, aren't necessarily going to work. We know that many people with cancer haven't been furloughed, they've been put on statutory sick pay, they're not going to be offered those protections going forward, and we're incredibly concerned about people with cancer potentially being the target for redundancies because they're not going to be able to attend their jobs, and they won't necessarily have the security of the scheme, which will obviously increase their financial insecurity and have really catastrophic impact on their mental health.
Thank you, Emma. I'm just going to turn to the next question. We have a really burning question from Sakia Naz, who also contributed to the publication. So she wrote an essay in the publication. I think she has a question around ethnicity and suicide rates. We're going to turn to her to ask the question. So Sakia, can you go ahead and fire away with your question?
Hi, Martin, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, hi, thank you. It's a question to Rosanna. So I'm one of the contributors towards this magazine, but I'm also one of the co-authors of a BME mental health guide that was commissioned by the NHS last year, and I put a link in it for the guide in the Q&A. But my question is around ethnicity rates, Rosanna, and suicide. There doesn't seem to be any clear data, so I'm just wondering if you have any information, or if you can please push on your side. It makes it really difficult for us on the ground who are doing a lot of the work to get that data.
Rosanna.
Thanks so much, Sakia, and thank you so much for what you're doing, and you're absolutely right. And there isn't a great deal of data. I believe that for a number of reasons, but I will certainly push, and I can certainly ask questions of the government, because they may have data that they are just not publishing. But I also think that it is so important that we encourage all communities to speak about suicide. I do know often what happens, there are societies that feel as though so I know of many families where someone and someone had a pre-existing heart failure that was never found out, or they may come and also make it very difficult to necessarily talk the data. And so I think it's important that we ensure that we make sure that everything's collected twice and broken down into ethnicity and community. Also, we encourage people where possible to, and that comes down to the stigma. Until we get on that, we find people very afraid to really be the truth.
Thank you, Rosanna. So we're going to go to another question, a really good question from Eamonn, who I'm not sure if Eamonn is there, who asked about barriers to mobility being higher for those with medical and particularly mental health. So Eamonn, I think, yeah, he's on microphone. Eamonn, can you pose a question to the panel?
Well, my comment was in response to something that Milo said about it being very difficult for people to be mobile in terms of where they live, because it's so difficult to put in place medical support and particularly mental health support. And this comes back to, I think, what Rosanna was saying, is that because it's difficult to get good support in place, that people are feel it's precarious and are worried about moving around in case they're unable to replicate it in living in a different area.
Eamonn?
Yes, did you catch that?
Yeah, we catch that. Okay, thanks, Eamonn, for that. Milo, what are your thoughts regarding overcoming the barriers to mobility, as Eamonn was targeting that question at you, Milo?
Well, I think it's just sort of working with the NHS to allow sort of double registration. So often the issue can be linked to students. You know, for example, you can register for 2 different properties, you know, where your home address and your student address, but you can't do that for NHS, and there's complications. So my brother has had sort of physical surgery, so he's had to be up and down for when he's trying, because he's registered his home address rather than, and of course that causes a lot of strain and stress, you know, having to explain to local GPs where he's registered, but then back to go for surgery. So I think it's all about making sure there's a dialogue, there's a clear dialogue, because often it's about making sure it's as easy as possible for whoever the person with a mental health issue has it, because often it's making sure the system is as user-friendly and you're removing those barriers as possible. Because often, sometimes if somebody's working far away from where their home base, it might be easier for them to be registered at a different GP, so if they've got nearby, so they can get the mental health services that might be more acceptable for them and more conducive to their working environment. Because we can't just say that we're working as if, you know, it's not 1948 anymore, and you have to make sure the NHS is moving with the times and make sure the barriers there are as practical as possible. And I think most people are willing to do that, but it's more about timing, effort, and training. And it's going to take a lot of time. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's making sure what barriers are there are removed as easily as and quickly as possible.
Thank you, Milo. There's a few questions coming in on housing and the impact on housing, in particular poor housing, on people's mental health. We have someone, Alistair, who mentioned that he advises people on renting and property issues, and that can also impact on people's mental health. I wanted to pose a question to you, Rosanna. You mentioned in your opening remarks, quite rightly, that mental health is a holistic issue. There are multiple contributing factors. With the poor state of housing in the UK, coupled with the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that people are self-isolating at home, that is a huge area that we need to focus on. So I wanted to get some of your thoughts on how Labour would approach the link between housing and poor mental health.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are a number of strands to unpick when it comes to housing, all of which can adversely affect people's mental health. The first is obviously the private rented sector. We know that there are hundreds of thousands of people in November that are going to potentially lose where they live. Sorry, not November, August, that are going to lose where they live, who so heavily rely on Labour having messages that show that they support people in the private rented sector. So it's really important that we get on top of that and show renters that we understand that, you know, precarious living conditions and living circumstances are such a driver of mental ill health. I mean, like the world we live in now, I literally with 2 young children had to rent a different flat every year for 6 years, and it brings so much insecurity, let alone at a time of COVID, where people are feeling as though they have suffered with their mental ill health, they have suffered in isolation, and have grown very attached to where they live. And some of the reasons why people are actually losing their ability to rent where they live currently are for reasons that don't make any sense. And even in my own constituency, I saw landlords try to boot people out in the middle of the COVID crisis because they didn't want to have to deal with people who were essentially potentially looking at losing their jobs. That's one strand, renters. The other is the I am touching it before, the adverse childhood experiences that are drivers of mental ill health going forward. So many children are living in temporary accommodation. That's only ever meant to be for 6 weeks. Sometimes they're in there for over 2 years. They are living in one room in a hotel with multiple siblings and parents who are very vulnerable. And if we can't get it right for these young people, they are basically being signed up to a life of potential difficulty. So we absolutely have to get the temporary accommodation situation sorted out. Then when you look at people who live in precarious housing situations and they are adults and they are people who are having to rely on insecure employment, they're relying on food banks, they're wondering how they're going to feed their children. You are seeing so many people coming into food banks more and more now. And the original reason they were coming in was mostly because of failures in the whole universal credit system. That has only got worse now. So I think if we don't get housing right, the mental health crisis that is inevitable at the moment will be even worse than it already looks to be.
Thank you, Rosanna. We have a question from YouTube. So we have someone, Emily, who's from the Young Fabians, watching this on YouTube via YouTube stream. She's asked the question, the following question. Her question is, what would be the specific support that you, as in Labour, would be pushing the government to commit to for child victims / witnesses of domestic abuse? She goes on to mention that it's worrying and shocking the rise in reported cases during lockdown and the horrific impact on children's mental health. As that question is directed to Rosanna, and in particular, I want to get an answer from you first before going to the other panelists. Rosanna.
What an important question. And I've actually just last week been speaking with specialists in this field because it is a very personal interest of mine. And so much focus and importantly so has been on victims of domestic violence with regards to the mother or the father. Much less attention is paid to the impact it has on children. We know that children can go on to develop something called complex PTSD, particularly if they have grown up with people in the home who are particularly narcissistic. This can go on to affect how they live their life going forward. And if we don't recognize that children themselves can be victims of domestic abuse when it comes to like neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse, but it is also, even if they are not directly being abused themselves, in witnessing their loved one, their parent or their guardian being abused, they are de facto being abused themselves. And we need to have this really understood and recognized, and we need to have this protection for children enshrined in law, and we need to ensure that the services are available, because inevitably children that witness this sort of domestic abuse are going to need to have therapy themselves. I wish I had longer to answer that question, but I'm so glad that you raised it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosanna, for that answer. And you know, it's such an important topic and something that needs to be tackled. You know, we've got lots of questions sort of flooding in. I want to get a few people in so that we can get as many people kind of involved as possible. In terms of, we've got a question or comment here that I think is quite interesting from David Chaisty about the terminology around mental health and sort of whether it's is the right terminology we should be using. I wondered if we could get him on audio and get David Chaisty to answer his question. So David, just make sure you're unmuted. Could you just pose a question around the terminology of mental health and just so that we can get the panelists to respond?
Well, I'll read out what I typed. How's that?
Go ahead.
The question is simply, is it possible that the terms mental ill health and mental health are disguising the pain of anguish? Could we make more progress with additional and more specific terms like mental distress and terms that are more descriptive of people's lived experiences?
Thank you, David. It's an interesting question because terminology and the words we use are so impactful and important. And I just wanted to get the views of different panel members on this terminology. Rosanna.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because when we talk about grief, being really upset and feeling anguish and bereavement is different to having mental ill health. And the way in which some people have described it to me, and something that I think sort of speaks to this, is if the person that you've lost, for example, if you are bereaved, if they came back into your life all of a sudden, like you could reverse time and they came back into your life, would you feel better? If the answer is yes, you're dealing with bereavement and anguish over loss. If you are suffering in a way that there is nothing that will improve how you're feeling, that is a good way to describe having mental ill health. And of course, there is a spectrum, isn't there? There is an absolute spectrum. So one of my friends describes it as when she feels that her depression takes hold so greatly that it wouldn't matter if she won the lottery, nothing would make her feel better. And so I think when there's no external factor that can improve how you feel, that is a very key indicator. And I think you're right to talk about terminology, because as well, there is a difference between feeling a bit down and needing to improve your well-being, which obviously is a buzzword at the moment everyone talks about, to suffering with bipolar, to having schizophrenia, to having depression. And even with depression, we know that there are the terms endogenous depression and exogenous depression. Exogenous depression, which is what most people have, will be as a result of external life circumstances that have happened. But endogenous depression is prevalent in about 1% of all those that have it, and it's a chemical imbalance that will always be there that you have to manage for a lifetime. And so I think you're absolutely right. We need to broaden the terminology used, because for some people it could be bereavement, for some people it could be needing to improve their well-being, and for some people it could just be bond or mental ill health. And I think it's good that we diversify the language around it.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Rosanna. I'm just going to quickly, we've got another quick, very interesting question here on private sector firms and how we can make private sector firms more accountable for mental ill health that they cause through the working environments they create. This came from Charlie via the YouTube stream, and I thought that was a really interesting comment. And I wondered whether Milo, you can quickly make a quick comment on that question. What are your thoughts around that, Milo?
Well, I think it's about making sure that, much like you would have workplace safety, you make sure the environment is safe for people's mental health. And if you notice an issue, whether that be how a boss is treating somebody or how they're acting, you'd call out somebody if they're being racist, sexist, and you should be able to have somewhere reporting that this person is not fostering a healthy environment and they need some sort of action taken against them. I don't know how you would do that, whether that be for a fine or forcible sort of like training exercise. So I think you need a bit of a carrot and stick approach. You need to make sure there's approach, you can make sure that people are going on the right courses, they know how to foster a good environment. But also if there are people who are, spoiling it for everybody else, spoiling the cart, you need to make sure that they are dealt with effectively, because companies want their workers to be happy, and because they're more productive, the more you can name all these benefits, you can say how great it is, but action needs to be taken. So I think you need a carrot and stick approach from the government to make sure there's a funding there, but also if there is action, you should name and shame them, much like you would do if somebody's not paying their taxes or is fostering environment. You can't just rely on Twitter cancellations. You have to make sure there's action appropriately done.
Thanks, Mano. That's a really interesting comment you made there in terms of having employers be more transparent about how they're approaching mental health. I wondered, Rosanna, what are your thoughts around that? As we want to build a society that takes mental health more seriously. We see a lot of corporate responsibility, a lot of companies saying that they are helping to make their work environments more better. What are your thoughts on, making corporates more, kind of holding them to account, Rosanna?
Well, yeah, I think there should. I believe that every workplace should be mandated to have mental health champions. That people should go on mandatory courses, just like when you start in any new workplace, you've got to go through the fire training and the manual handling. I think it's ridiculous that we don't have training on mental health, how to spot your colleagues as well if they may be not being themselves, what to do about it. And actually, I've been talking a lot to the trade unions about this, and some have said that they really would like to see a mental health act that has to be adopted by workplaces. And I really like that idea, because we know that a lot of big corporates like to tick boxes, oh, we're green and all we care about people's mental health. But when it comes down to it, for me, the litmus test is, can you pick up the phone, call your boss and say, I'm not coming in because I feel depressed? And if the answer is no, they're doing something wrong.
Exactly. Thank you, Rosanna. Well, running a bit out of time, we've had such a wide-ranging discussion about so many different topics, and it's great to have you, Milo, Emma, and Rosanna here. I just wondered if you could sum up some of your thoughts on this discussion. There's so much to take away, and I can tell from the comment section, lots of people have commented on their own lived experience, and this is a very difficult topic, but it's great to come together and to discuss this. So I'll first of all turn to you, Emma, to sum up some of the thoughts.
Thank you, Milo. Martin, sorry, Martin. Yeah, so I think this has been a really interesting discussion, and I think what's really been revealed is just how far-reaching the mental health impacts have been of COVID and how much work needs to be done. I do believe that in order to deal with mental health inequalities, we need parity of esteem, and that needs to be embedded within not only legislation, but within action. We need to see employers, schools, communities, really sort of taking a lead on this. I was just referring back to the question earlier. It was interesting because at Macmillan, we have mental health first aiders in every team. There was a mental health support offer for furloughed and non-furloughed staff. And I do genuinely think that we need to have a mental health safety executive distinct from the health and safety executive as an independent body that can really help to enforce these things, because the mental health challenge doesn't just end with COVID. It's going to be with us for a long time to come, and we need to have more conversations like this to discuss policy, so that we can not only support other people, but so that we have a mental health system which works for everyone going forward.
Thank you, Emma. I just want to turn to you, Milo.
Exactly. I think if we are to tackle mental health, it has to be done in a comprehensive way. We've seen issues raised about housing, how local authorities, how we do the etymology of words and how we describe conditions. So I think it takes everything from community groups, whether that be your Alcoholics Anonymous village shop, to big organizations such as Trade Union Congress or the CBI. All these need to come together and create an environment that actually works for all concerned, and make sure the levels where you can report something are effective, and that nobody should struggle alone. And it's not an issue just of putting money into it, it's make sure the system functions as properly, and that if somebody has an issue and they're at the weakest, that they can get the help they need. No stops, they don't have to go route around to different places. And I think that's what government should do. It should serve the weakest and most vulnerable society, and that's often those mental health conditions.
Thank you, Milo. And I just want to turn to Rosanna for your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for involving me tonight. I would say that the challenge is this. We're all on this call tonight because we care. Pretty much, I'd say, I would guess the majority of us get it. We understand the issues, and we are really steely in our resolve to improve it for everybody. The challenge is to bring people along with us that aren't. And that is where the fight is going to come going forward. And that isn't just about government. And Milo's right, it's not simply just about getting more money, though we do need more money and it's my job to keep bashing the government to get it. But we need to open up for discussion to people around us that wouldn't ordinarily be comfortable having the discussion and wouldn't ordinarily be used to having the discussion. That could be our housemates, our family, our communities, our community leaders, our mums and dads. You know, it's about bringing those on board with us so that they can get it too, because by doing that, we make it better for everybody else. And I would say that it really is okay not to feel okay. And I say this every time because I think it's so important. And if this resonates with just one person, then I feel I've done my job. Like, it is so hard to suffer with mental ill health. It is so hard to suffer with anguish and bereavement. And actually, if that's not dealt with properly, that can lead to longer term issues. But it's also really, really hard to watch people you love, your family members, your best friends, go through this as well. And it's okay not to feel okay. Ask for help. There are people out there who genuinely care, for whom you matter to. And that might be picking up the phone and calling Samaritans. That might be calling your friend. It might be calling your loved one. It is about being vulnerable. But if you take anything away from anything I've said tonight, just please know that I take it so seriously as a politician, but I'm not here as a politician, actually. I'm here as someone really who cares so much and knows how much it matters. So when it comes to campaigning on a political level for change, my door is always open to hear from you. I do this on behalf of all of us. And thank you so much for having me here tonight. And I'm here to serve you and everyone in our communities who are suffering and just needs that extra bit of help. So thank you.
Thank you, Rosanna. And again, you know, we here at the Fabians and the Young Fabians, we want to thank you for your work in championing mental health from the front bench, and also the work you've been doing on the front line during the COVID-19 pandemic. We really appreciate it. Lots of the remarks that were made by all our panelists have been very impactful, and this is a very difficult topic to discuss. And I want to, first of all, thank all the contributors to the publication. And I want to thank Milo, Emma, and Rosanna for taking part in this discussion. If any of the topics that we mentioned has touched you in any way and you want to reach out to the Fabian Health Policy Group or the Young Fabian Health Network, our contact details are on the Fabian website. The publication will be available shortly to be downloaded from the Fabian website, and there's a link in the comments section where you can download it. I want to finally thank Milo, Emma, and Rosanna for being here today. And one thing that I do believe in having you, Rosanna, on the front bench, we will continue to push the government and hold the government to account on mental health. And hopefully, when it comes to 2024, we'll have a Labour government and we'll have you, Rosanna, not only in Parliament, but leading change from the government benches. Thank you all for taking part, and we're going to bring this event to a close. Take care and have a great evening. Thank you for attending. Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.